So our next speaker now is Professor Dr. Michel Boivin, and let me introduce him briefly. And Professor Michel will actually speak on the topic of language, script, and power in the Sindhi society before and after 1947. Professor Dr. Michel Boivin is a historian and anthropologist with a specialization on the Muslim societies in South Asia, a former director of the Center for South Asian Studies. He is now affiliated with the Center for the Study of South Asia and the Himalayas. He teaches historical anthropology of the Muslim societies in South Asia at the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, where he also supervises PhD students. So I would like to request you, please come for your keynote speech.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference, and thank you all the scholars, the people and friends who are here. As you can see in the title, I shifted a little bit because I wanted to present a kind of different perspective. So I will try to speak about Sindh, of course, but also about France, to see the process through which in two different countries with very different situations, dominant languages were imposed by different categories of population and especially different power. And so a main issue in this context is the issue of literature, because for the British who are colonizing Sindh and for the dominant social classes in France, the main issue to select an official language was its relation with literature. And so both in France, the ruling elite and the British in Sindh tried to define and to select criteria. And to find criteria to state this dialect was a language because there was a literature. So it's very interesting to see that in both countries there was a kind of similar process. And of course, it is very common to oppose, I would say, the global north and the global south, or even the white and the non-white people. But I think that it would be very interesting to give you some information about the process through which, for example, in France, the dominant, the ruling classes impose their own vision of culture, literature, and language on the other people, especially the one living in rural area. And that's why I put a quotation of this American scholar who published a book about this process in France at the turning point of the 19th and the 20th century. And as you can see, in this book, this scholar and many others draw already a parallel between the domination of the ruling elite in Europe on the local population and the process itself of colonization. And to some extent, his argument is that first, the ruling classes in France treated their population in the rural area like colonial subject for a number of things, but here I want to focus on language, dialect, and literature. But first, let us start with Sindh. And of course, everybody knows that the British conquered Sindh in 1843. But before, since they were already in India, in South Asia, in 1835, the British power in India suppressed Persian as official language. Professor Rahman told us about previously. And so they used different local languages. And as you know, in 1835, Sindh was not British. But when Sir Bartle Frere became commissioner in Sindh in 1850, he wanted also to suppress Persian as official language and to replace it by English, of course, and Sindhi. But the issue was, what is Sindhi language? Because there were different dialects of Sindhi. And so the British started to talk how they could select a given dialect of Sindhi to be the official Sindhi language. And once again, the main yardstick, the main criteria was the literature. It means that especially if a dialect is not written, it's not a language. And also, they didn't care about all the folk tales, all this. Only they thought that for a literature, you should have manuscript, you should have written literature. And so that they started to think about, and it's very interesting to see that the British themselves disagree about this issue, about finally what literature you can find in Sindh, in one or in another Sindhi dialect. So they disagree. And for the first British, especially this book, Grammar of the Sindhi Language, by Captain John Stack, it's too early. He claimed that there was not literature in Sindhi. It was not possible to find literature in Sindhi according to his own conception. And so he proposed for official language for the province of Sindh, he could propose Hindustani, he could propose other languages, but not Sindhi. And finally, a main change occurred when Captain Burton, very famous, came. He was a member of the British Army, but he was maybe the first to claim there was a Sindhi literature. And of course, especially he turned to the Sindhi literature, and he mentioned Shajari Salo of Shah Abdul Latif. So it was a main change, and Captain Burton took a leading role in all this discussion, first about which dialect in Sindhi should be selected to be the Sindhi language and standardized language also for Sindh. So even Stack and Burton and others disagree. Was it the Vicholi, was it the Lari, this and that, but unfortunately we don't have really the minutes of the discussion. And finally, what was the final criteria for the final selection, because finally the British selected the Vicholi, the dialect from central Sindh, to be the official Sindhi language. So maybe, but as I say, I could not find historical evidence. Maybe they consider it was spoken by the majority. Also, it was there was the fact that Hyderabad, the previous capital, was in the Vicholi-speaking area in Sindh, and it was the seat of power before the British. This and that. But also, what I could observe, it is that these British, because as Professor Rahman said, it was because Sir Bartle Frere wanted the British officers and administrators to learn Sindhi, but finally, of course, to control better the local population. It was not because initially they loved Sindhi of this and that. But what was very amazing, so finally it was decided for the standardized Sindhi in 1852, but if you look at the Gazetteer of Sindh, published in 1907 by this British Etcan, his view on the Sindhi, still he claimed there is no Sindhi literature, and so he gave a negative qualification, I would say, to the Sindhi language. So, even half a century after the Sindhi language was selected, still some British officers were not aware about the situation and still claim that Sindhi was not a language because the lack of literature. Yeah, so this map are about the different Sindhi dialects, and also I'm not at all a linguist. I should have precised. I am addressing this issue as a historian and anthropologist. But what I can say, so these are today maps regarding the distribution, geographical distribution of Sindhi dialect. But as you can see, there are some differences between these two maps. So after the issue related to the language, there was the issue related to the scripts, and once again, the previous scholar spoke about. And so still there were discussions between the British officer and especially Captain Stack and Captain Burton, of course. Some were advocating Devanagari script, other Nastaliq, other Nasr, and even some Rudavadi script. This script, I will turn back later on, which was used by the Hindu merchant. So to some extent, Captain Stack was defending the use of Rudavadi as official script for Sindhi. But Burton was much more convincing because finally it was decided in Bombay, because as you know, Sindh was a part of the Bombay presidency. So the final decision went to the governor of Bombay, but Burton was very convincing. And so finally, Nasr script was adopted. But even so, you can see a number of differences in the first year in the use of Nasr for writing Sindhi. Because, for example, if you have a look at the Grammar of Sindhi Language published by Ernst Trump in 1877, he made, to some extent, his own Nasr Sindhi alphabet, and so he created a new sign from Arabic for giving Sindhi sound, but now they are not used at all. So since even in the 19th century, last part of the 19th century, all the scholars and British, they didn't really use the same Nasr Sindhi alphabet. But this issue of script was very important because as put by, it is in the book by Captain Stack, The Grammar of Sindhi Language, he identified 17 scripts in which Sindhi was written. So as you can see, but it would be very interesting to discuss the different categories he used to name this script, because as we can see, most of them come from Devanagari, and there is this Rudavadi. Also, there are different caste script, all very close to Rudavadi script. For example, the Kochki, as you can see, also the script used by the Memon, etc. So, if I'm putting this script, it is because even after Nasr was adopted as script, there was a kind of new discussion, and once again, I could not find in the archives in Karachi and even in London many evidence. I don't really know why the script has been selected, but in the 1870s, there was a new movement, and still some British wanted to select the Rudavadi, or they claimed that two different scripts should be adopted for the Sindhi, the Nasr for the Muslim, but the Rodavadi for the Hindu. And from the 1870s, you can find a number of books, I don't know how many, but a number of books published in Rodavadi. For example, there is a big collection in the British Library in London of Sindhi books in Rodavadi, and also it's interesting to see that the British, we were supposed to catalog these books, made many mistakes in the different script used for Sindhi. Yeah, but this Rodavadi was never officially used, despite this production of books in this script, and even the British started in the same year, 1870s, schools where this script were taught, but so it was not to last a long time. No, I'm not going in the right way. Yeah, so it's also related to this Rodavadi, and even Sir Bartle Frere, he asked to all the district governor this and that to collect different Rodavadi alphabet and to finally select one to be also the official Rodavadi. So now I'm traveling to the west, to France. Of course, the situation is very different. So just few words. French is a Latin language. It comes from Latin, like Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, 4 Latin languages, not English, not German. And also Latin, because the people locally become Christian, they adopted Latin as official language. In all the kingdoms of Europe, Latin was used as official language until the 16th century. And in France especially, the first document in French was produced by the King of France in, I don't know, 1520 or something like this. And from this time, French was used. So what is very interesting, and in relation also with the main issue of endangered language, it is that France and French initially were spoken in the region of Paris. Yeah, you can see Paris. But it was a small area, and even the name France comes from this small area. But it was an area where the kings were staying. And you know the history of France during the whole Middle Age, from 10th century to 16th, the kings were fighting to enlarge their kingdom because there were others and they succeeded. And so finally, that's why French became the official language. So it was, of course, an issue of politics and domination because there were many other dialects spoken in the other part of France. And when we arrived to the French Revolution, starting in 1789, it was a main effort to impose French to all the other. And you can see how this guy, for example, he was a priest, Abbé Grégoire, how he was talking about other French dialect, about the other dialect. It was very derogatory. He was very contemptuous with the other dialect, and still because he considered there is no literature in this dialect, so they don't deserve to be considered as language. And in French, they used a word, patois, which was a very bad word for naming the local dialects outside of the Parisian region where French was spoken. Yeah, but it was a slow process to impose French. because as you can see, even in the late part of the 19th century, the majority of the population was not speaking in French. And finally, what was the main change? It was when in 1882, the central government made French compulsory in education, and the pupils, the children, were not allowed to speak their own dialect, otherwise they were punished or even ejected. So it was the first step when French really gained in the process. And the last step when French became really the majority language was the First World War in 1914, because all the Germans invaded France, and so the government called the army, and French were the language, most of the officers, etc., were spoken. So it doesn't mean that all accepted the domination of France. In the second half of the 19th century, there were a kind of resistance local. For example, this scholar, Frédéric Mistral, on the left, he tried to defend his own language, Provençal, from south of France, and he was trying to give evidence there was a literature, always the issue of literature, this and that, but unfortunately it was not successful. And even in another area of France, Savoie, in the Alps near Switzerland, there was this lady, Amélie Gex also, who tried to develop the writing in her own dialect, Savoyard, but still it was it was not successful at all. So today, France is largely in very majority speaking French, but I wanted just to say how the central government and the new elite from the bourgeoisie in France, who replaced the aristocracy when there was a king, impose their own language as a tool of domination, finally, as the British did in the scene who were colonized. Thank you very much.